Hello, I'm Jim Demmon with Clark County Close-Up. Thanks for meeting with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, first, what is the Clark Regional Emergency Services Agency?
CRESA is an interlocal agency that is a service provider providing emergency services to Clark County and its cities and to the fire districts in Clark County. We're probably best known as the 911 agency for Clark County, but there's also the program that I'm involved in, which is the Emergency Management Program, which is involved in planning and preparing for disasters, either human-caused or natural disasters. And so those are the key services that we provide to Clark County and its cities.
And again, your role with CRESA?
I'm an emergency management coordinator, so I'm one of 6 people who report to a program manager, and we're all responsible for different aspects of the comprehensive emergency management program for the county. My specific focus area is on hazard mitigation and recovery. Hazard mitigation, of course, is what we'll be talking about here today.
Okay, now let's get into that. So, CRESA is developing is leading a joint effort, I should say, to work on a hazard mitigation plan. What is a hazard mitigation plan?
So, a hazard mitigation plan is a plan or a course of action for how governments will work to reduce long-term disaster risks. And so this is a little bit different than the emergency planning that CRESA does and a lot of our partners do. Traditionally, we're focused on when a disaster happens, what are we going to do in order to respond to that disaster? So that's looking at how do we notify responders, how do the responders act to protect lives and property, how do we do mass care and shelter, how do we evacuate, and how do we recover, and that kind of thing. The hazard mitigation plan focuses on something fairly different, which is we're really looking at what do we do before a disaster occurs to reduce the impacts of that disaster. So just to give you a few examples, is that a fairly typical example, as you can see in the picture, is that for homes that are in a flooded area or in a flood hazard zone, what we can do is we can invest some funds into elevating those structures. Okay. So you take a jack, you get into the house, you lift it up from its foundation, and you can either build like a cripple wall or some stilt type structures to raise that to get the finished floor level to where it's above the flood zone. And that's a fairly effective way to reduce the impacts of a flood. You can also do things like you can restrict development in flood hazard zones. You can put requirements so that when you do build into a flood hazard zone, it's that your finished floor is at a higher level. You can also buy out homes or structures or relocate structures so that they're outside of that flood hazard zone. So that's a flooding example.
And again, all this is in preparation for
this is all something we do before a disaster occurs. This is, it's the old ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which is that it makes more sense to take action now to reduce our vulnerabilities so we're not dealing with the devastation that you see so often on the TV and in other communities, and sometimes as we've had it in our own community from the impacts of these disasters. Other examples is in earthquakes. For example, a common impact is that homes will be knocked off a foundation, and that's also in the picture here. So, for example, we can take action to seismically retrofit homes to bolt them to their foundations. You can secure a water heater in your home to keep the water heater from getting knocked over, and that kind of thing. So. That's an example of earthquake mitigation, as we can look at seismic retrofits.
We were talking that code has already been changed for somewhat newer homes that they do those things.
Correct.
But the older homes wouldn't have those things unless someone came in and did them.
Exactly. So in general, homes built before, let's say before the 50s, they were really just built to resist gravity. They were built to resist the forces of gravity, to keep the roof up and to keep the building upright. Starting in about the 1950s, there was a recognition of some seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest, and so you started to see that homes were bolted to their foundation. There was less of a reliance on unreinforced masonry, which is particularly hazardous. And then starting in the 90s, early 90s, is when a relatively new code came about, which is where homes are much more secure. They're bolted to their foundation, hot water heaters are secured, and there's much more of an accommodation of lateral forces that you get with earthquake shaking. So newer homes, generally there's a good rule of thumb, is newer homes are going to be safer than older homes in an earthquake. Another example is wildfire protection. Is that a good example of a hazard mitigation strategy for wildfire protection is to take flammable materials, vegetation, and that kind of thing, and cut it back at least 30 feet from your home. It's what they call a defensible space. And so that's a good example of wildfire mitigation that you can see. So those are all things, again, it makes more sense to do that now than to deal with the devastation afterwards. And what our hazard mitigation plan does is it looks to build a sort of a community agreement on what are the things that we want to do before a disaster occurs in terms of public infrastructure, looking at roads and bridges, looking at water utilities and other things like that. Also looking at how we develop, what is our plan. We want to integrate our hazard mitigation plan, for instance, with the growth management plans as well, to make sure that we're being smart about how we develop, so that we're creating inherently safe communities that are going to be good, now and into the future.
And I believe you mentioned that we currently have a plan. When was that created?
So our original plan was completed in 2004. These plans are developed in accordance with the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, and that's basically the guideline that says that jurisdictions, in order to be eligible for certain federal grant funds, the jurisdictions should have these hazard mitigation plans. And so we had that. We actually did take some good substantive actions, completed some of the things that were identified in that plan. We also learned some things that we're going to adapt to the new plan. We need to change it because our community has changed. Mm-hmm. And so we need to update it to reflect the growth, the development, and also the new information that we have about hazards in our community as well.
Now, when do you anticipate completing the plan?
Our goal is to have the plan completed by September of 2016. So it's roughly a 1-year term that we'll have to complete the plan.
And we're kind of running out of time, so I just want to go. So what's the quick process for creating this plan?
Sure. Yeah. Basically, some of us we've already done, but we want to identify our stakeholders. We've identified 18 planning partners who will participate. They will have a chapter in the plan. We also have a steering committee that we formed, which is a multidisciplinary steering committee to help guide the project and really identify what the plan looks like. There are requirements for public involvement, so we'll look at ways of methods for the public to get involved in terms of participating in public meetings, workshops, surveys, and that kind of thing. We'll do a risk assessment. So an important part of the process is that we want to identify where is our community going to break, is the way to think about it. If we have a flood, where are the flood hazard areas? If we have an earthquake, where is our greatest risk? And so we do that. So then the next part of the process is we identify goals and actions that will help strengthen us where we are weak, as identified in that risk assessment. And then we put the document together to document our findings, and then we implement that plan.
Okay. So you mentioned the types of disasters the plan may address, and that's still being considered, but we're talking earthquakes, wildfires, what other types of?
So those two, earthquakes and floods, are sort of the big ones. We're mostly focused on natural hazards. So earthquakes, floods, droughts, wildfires, landslides, which are sort of hand in hand with floods. Volcano, we will also look at volcano risks. And then the one human affected disaster that we'll also incorporate is dam failure, since we do have the Lewis River projects in the northern border of Clark County will also address the issue of dam failure. So.
Okay, now in preparing for this interview, you sent me a link to a New Yorker article about the potential for a massive earthquake on the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And as well, there's recently been an OPB special about a potential, talking about what we can do in advance. So what can people do now at home, at work, to prepare for a major disaster like an earthquake?
Sure. And yeah, that New Yorker article, which was called The Really Big One, was a really eye-opening article. If a lot of people read that, it was a very well done article, and they interviewed a lot of really good people for that. And where it comes from, at least in origination, is that there's some new information that we have that's come out in the past few years about the risk of a subduction zone earthquake, which is a unique type of earthquake. At least in the United States, it's unique to the Pacific Northwest. And compared to the typical local shallow earthquakes, where you have 30 to 45 seconds of ground shaking, in a subduction zone earthquake, you're looking at up to 5 minutes or possibly even more of ground shaking.
Which is similar to what happened in Japan.
Correct. Yeah, the Tohoku earthquake in Japan is an example of that earthquake. As a matter of fact, we're set up, our setup of our subduction zone, our Cascadia subduction zone threat is very similar to the Japan threat, because as far as where it is off our coast and that kind of thing. The Chile earthquake was another example. The Indonesian earthquake, and here in the United States, the 1964 Good Friday earthquake in Alaska was a subduction zone event. And of course, we have it on very good evidence that in January of 1700, we had a subduction zone event off the Oregon and Washington coast, right here in the Pacific Northwest. So this is something that will eventually happen. There's a long history of that.
And it could be potentially California all the way up Washington into Canada. I mean, we're talking a wide area.
Correct. Yeah, the subduction zone basically runs from Northern California, from Cape Mendocino up to Vancouver Island. Basically, it's a very large swath area. And worst case scenario is you could have that whole area slip at what they call a full rip. That's kind of our worst case scenario of a 9.0 magnitude earthquake. So these are very powerful earthquakes. So the great thing about that New Yorker article is it really focused a lot in examining the mitigation issues and our earthquake risk, and looking at our built environment and the problems that the fact that we're basically behind places like Japan and Chile in the resiliency of our buildings and our roads and our bridges. So in terms of what the public can do in order to get ready for a subduction zone earthquake, I think the first thing to do is to look at mitigation and to look at that in your house and in your workplace. So in your home, if your home was built before 1970, have you looked at whether it is bolted to the foundation? There should be bolts every 4 to 6 feet on your foundation to tie it into the concrete your sill into the concrete foundation to ensure that it's secured. You need, is your water heater secure? There are also some really simple things you can do in terms of non-structural mitigation to, go around your house and look at if there's ground shaking, what is going to tip over and fall, and what's going to fall on somebody, maybe even in your bedroom or where you spend a lot of time. Look at your kitchens and look at other furniture, shelving, and what you have there. And then you really need to think seriously about what you can do to remedy that. Can you relocate some tall furniture to where it's going to not block an exit route or not fall on somebody and hurt them? Can you move heavy things that are up on a high shelf down to a lower shelf? Can you fasten your furniture to the studs so that it doesn't tip over? So that's an example. That's all example of pre-disaster hazard mitigation, and it can be done in the home, and that's a really important thing for people to do in order to reduce their risk from earthquake.
And then also, what about like a preparedness kit? How long should people anticipate potentially being on their own? I mean, with no water, sewer, things that you take for granted. What can they do for the preparedness kit?
Well, I think my first answer to that has to be that there's some personal choice, and that's kind of a personal decision that people need to make. Traditionally we've talked about a 3-day term, a 3-day period of time, but particularly in regard to the subduction zone threat, I think people need to consider a 2-week period of time in order to have materials. The reason for that is that in an earthquake, if your house is bolted to its foundation and everything is nice and secure, your home should probably be okay. A 1 or 2-story wood frame structure, even in a subduction zone earthquake, should be a fairly safe place to be, again, if you've done the basic things in order to secure it. The problem is going to be the disruption of supply lines. So if you're able to get to the store, if those roads and bridges that allow you to access your local grocery store are open, there may be issues there around if there's any food at that store, because, again, supply lines, how that store gets its food, those supply lines may have been disrupted. So that's a very harsh reality that I think we need to plan for, and why it's important to even think in terms of a length of as long as 2 weeks in order to get the food and the water, so that you can sort of ride it out in the island of your home to be prepared.
Now, if people want more information about the plan or how they can get prepared, I did see some resources on your website. So where can they check?
So CRESA911.org is the CRESA website. That will tell you everything about our organization, our 911 program, in addition to our emergency management program. We've just went live with a website for our Hazard Mitigation Plan, and that has information about the planning project. It's also got other information in there about how the public can prepare. Okay. We are going to be, I'm also going to be doing a series of blog articles. We do have a CRESA blog, which you can also access through CRESA911.org, and that's going to be the Preparedness by Prevention series, which is where I'm going to talk about things like about how to secure your home and how to do mitigation in your home and in your workplace, so that we're first doing those prevention activities as a priority. So the CRESA911.org site is going to have some stuff both about preparedness, personal and home preparedness, and about hazard mitigation and our hazard mitigation planning project. There will be if you want to sign up to receive notices about meetings, public meetings and workshops, and other milestones in the planning project, there's a way to sign up at that website there as well too. In terms of other recommendations for preparedness, I think another good resource is ready.gov, which is the official FEMA website that really is everything you'd want to know in terms of guidance for how to personally prepare in terms of having a kid and developing an emergency plan and that kind of thing.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good luck with developing this plan.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity.